I'm going to go ahead and pick back up, hopefully, so we also get a clean recording. And it looks like this is doing a bit better with me sitting a bit closer. All right, so thank you all for being here this evening. The registrations for this presentation have grown beyond my regular audience, so I'm going to start with a little bit about myself to help ground what I'll be exploring over the next chapter. If you've seen a lot of my other talks or watched the recordings on my website, the first 5 minutes or so will be a bit familiar, but please hang around. This is almost all new material, and a lot like my presentation on planting complex plant communities covered what I learned over the last 5 or so years of working with native plants, packed into just 55 minutes. This talk is what I've learned over the last 5 or so years about how to be in healthy relationship with ecosystems, especially for those of us who, for whatever reason, have been uprooted from our ancestral connection with land and our more than human community. I'll be speaking from my experience as someone of settler descent, and the times that I use we and us in this presentation, I am speaking from that place. So a little bit about me. I am a lifelong gardener. Like a lot of children, I got a chance to plant some seeds when I was quite young in a spring, probably just about 40 years ago now. That little seed that I put into the ground grew into a giant squash vine, and I was hooked. It was and still is the best magic in the whole wide world. I read all the gardening books in the Picton Public Library. I ordered seeds from Stokes and Dominion and plants from the Rockwood Garden Fires and saved up my allowance for trips to the nursery. My career followed a path through garden centers and greenhouses into gardening and landscape design. I received awards for my work, and I was heavily involved in the professional horticultural and landscaping world. But over the years, more and more of that world was being taken over by concrete and stone. I was getting more and more uncomfortable and was looking for something else. I just didn't know what it was. I found the seed of it finally in a book, one that, despite being all about plants, was not shelved in the garden section of the bookstore, but in the Indigenous section. Plants have so much to give us. All we have to do is ask. Anishinaabe Botanical Teachings by Mary Siisip, Geniusz. A book filled with practical and scientific details alongside and on equal footing with teaching stories. Stories of plants as living beings with gifts and abilities that they share with us. A book written from the perspective of a human within nature, rather than viewing nature as a system separate from the human one. Of being in relationship with, rather than exerting control over, the lives and ecosystems that surround us and make our lives possible. She described it, the type of connection I had been looking for in gardening. I had followed the path into horticulture that had been drawn by the industry, trends, and marketing. I hadn't followed the plants. The plants hadn't forgotten how to be in relationship. I had, my ancestors had, my culture had. That book and others that I found over the next few years was the catalyst of change for me, completely altering my day-to-day work. It is still all about plants, a whole lot more so, in fact, but it isn't about landscaping anymore. One of the things that eventually soaked in for me as I was internalizing this different relationship is that landscaping and gardening, as it is almost always taught, and it is done within the horticultural industry, is the process and service of physically colonizing the land. We remove native vegetation, even native rock and soil, and replace them with more familiar or tractable species and materials. We compose spaces that are pleasing to culturally instilled appreciation of order and predictability. We create plant compositions designed to fit within culturally prescribed aesthetics rather than for their ecological roles. We mow and trim and manicure to keep the landscape in a state of stasis rather than progression. We rake or blow away the leaves and stems that cover the ground and feed the soil, and we lay down decorative mulch in their place. We call land property. But most of us don't come to gardening with the intention of practicing colonization. We come to gardening with the desire to nurture a relationship with the rest of nature. I've spent the last few years figuring out what livelihood work that holds that relationship at its center could be for me. I think I found some possibilities, certainly in the work of bringing native species back to the spaces that they've been removed and excluded from. But I'll dive into the specifics of that in another talk sometime between now and the spring. It's on my to-do list somewhere after set up a newsletter and before dig the pots of winter sown seeds out of the snow and bring them in for early germination at the end of March. For today, I'm focusing on some things that can apply to work with plants, but also to any work that is about cultivating healthy, respectful, care-centered relationship with ourselves, with our communities, and with our ecosystems, on what can help us with growing a healthy world beyond the edges of our gardens. Most of us have likely seen some version of this image. It's frequently included in permaculture, regeneration, and organic land care presentations, as well as any space where the rights of more than human lives are being discussed. Over the last decade, the vast majority of what I found in these and similar spaces has focused on caring for the lives relegated to the lower layers of the hierarchical pyramid and working to forestall their collapse as the costs and weight of current societal structures are piled onto them. And there is definitely care and harm reduction work that is needed to support those bearing the weight of today's hierarchical system. Unfortunately, this kind of work, a kind of supportive care work, can easily end up unintentionally propping up the pyramid itself, if not paired with a great deal of advocacy for change, attention to outcomes, and ongoing re-evaluation. The weight of this work also often consumes all of our available time and energy and leaves us without the physical, emotional, and mental resources to explore and practice the work of moving out of a position at or near the top of the pyramid and into a place within a circle of care, especially if we're trying to figure out and navigate that transition all on our own. But this is a transition that needs to happen. Even if we set aside the suffering that is caused by this pyramid, it is trembling on the edge of collapse. Roughly half the lives outside of direct human control that these images represent have disappeared within my own lifetime, and the rate of collapse is accelerating. It isn't just a question of emissions and heating climate. How land is being treated in this hierarchy is the primary driver of biodiversity collapse. Change is needed. Change is possible, but figuring out where to start can be hard, and it's so very easy to get stuck, get discouraged, and get burnt out. It is also far too easy to get overwhelmed by the so desperately needed care within the hierarchy and not have the personal or social resources left for nurturing change. The other common barrier is the question of how to cultivate the skills needed for participating in circles of care for those of us who have spent our lives within the pyramid of hierarchy. This isn't simple, but fortunately, it also isn't something that needs to be started from scratch. More and more Indigenous voices.
I did.
Just using a few microphones. More and more Indigenous voices are not only being raised, but are finally gaining access to platforms such as book publishing, media, and academia, and the perspectives and lessons that they have to offer are becoming accessible to those of us who have long been isolated from them. Simply listening to these voices as they teach and tell stories from within circles of relationship is a good place to start. But any significant change has to move from idea to practice to become real. Changing or challenging a pattern by letting go of the enforced control of the plant and insect communities in the spaces we care for, planting that pollinator garden can be the seed of disruption for the larger patterns of conforming with current expectations about what is and isn't acceptable as a member of the community. But it is a seed that needs to grow and spread beyond the borders of our gardens to truly disrupt the hierarchical model and make space for interdependent community and mutual care. Far too often, when looking for solutions to inequity, whether racial, gender, or in the case of the more than human world, transitioning our gardens from non-native to native species, the default is to try to bring the exploited or excluded into the existing system. I think this comes from the idea that because those near the top of the pyramid control the most resources, we must have the best model for living. So reconciliation means making that available to everyone who hasn't been benefiting from it until now. I think this also comes from an embedded belief that the pyramid is inevitable and necessary and that there aren't any other serious, believable possibilities. Something that you'll quickly encounter if you start openly talking about systemic change. Initial responses tend to vary anywhere from anger from people who are personally attached to the status quo or threatened by change to verbal pats on the head because you're just so adorably naive. It isn't a wonder that anger and frustration power so many change efforts, but they tend to embed a burnout cycle in the work, and my health won't allow me to participate in that. So I've had to look for hopeful sources of energy to sustain my efforts instead. While there are definitely some difficult parts in the resources I'm recommending today, they all also contain pieces, some of them big pieces, of what I believe is needed for change to happen. And that is where I find the hopeful energy to persist rather than giving up and going to live in a cabin in the woods. An option that is actually open to me as one of the globally privileged people living in middle-class Canada at this point in time. It's not open to everybody. So how to move out of pyramidal hierarchy thinking and skills and into a relational alternative is a question that I can't fully answer because I'm still very much at the start of the process myself. But I can share some of the crumbs that I've been following, some of the glimmers I've seen, and somehow I've been trying to shift my own thinking and problem solving. Some things weren't too challenging, even if they did take time. I started with learning to speak about plants as beings rather than items, as they and them rather than it. To speak about land and ecosystems that I'm in relationship with without flattening them down with the label of property. With the work that I do, this is a good starting point for me. It took a while and a lot of editing and reworking of sentences, but now it flows pretty smoothly. If you follow my Facebook Native Plant series, you won't find it as a term for the plants, at least I hope not. I've tried to make sure that wasn't in there. It's they and them, they are beings. But a lot like planting a pollinator garden, it is a starting point, not the end of the journey. Respecting land as being more than just property and plants and their communities as beings to be in relationship with, which are valuable for their being, not just for what they do for me, isn't the same as knowing how to actually be in those relationships. Whether living in urban, suburban, or agricultural areas, few of us are lucky enough to find in-person examples of what it is to live in healthy, reciprocal relationship more than human world. The requirement to bring land into cultivation and to extract a profit from it goes all the way back to the original influx of European settlers, and it still persists to this day in things like the National Capital Commission farm lease agreement. With so few in-person examples of healthy human-land relationships, I turned to some other spaces. I like to read, and I found I quite enjoy listening to audiobooks while working at things like cleaning and planting seeds and transplanting tiny seedlings, activities that fill quite a lot of my hours these days. And all of the books I'll be mentioning in this presentation, they are available in print, digital, and audiobook formats. And I will send the list and the link to the along with the link of this recording by email in the next day or two. And I have soaked in quite a few books over the last few years, returning to the ones that felt like they had the most to teach me multiple times, to take in more layers and strands of the ideas and the patterns that they offered. I started with Indigenous writers, especially ones from cultures that had spent the last few millennia caring for the ecosystem I currently live in. Works by Indigenous authors led me to works by Black authors, which led me to works by people with disabilities or other traits that capitalism defines as rendering a person without value, as acceptable collateral losses, the cost of doing business. And I saw a lot of the same patterns at all different scales. In the range of topics that were explored, ideas and beliefs that I was recognizing and was frustrated with in my plant-centered spaces about what behaviors are acceptable, about control, about exploitability, about rights being held superior to responsibilities. I also came across ideas about how to challenge or displace those patterns, because of all the parallels, it isn't just the problems that are shared, the solutions can be as well. I was far from the first person to see the problems, and I am happy and relieved to say that I don't need to invent the solutions. We can draw on the thinking and build off the work of people with far more experience, creativity, and knowledge than myself to see and cultivate change. As I mentioned, my search for examples started with Indigenous authors. The perspectives that they share can help to make the problems more visible, the possibility of something different more tangible, and provide some ideas of how to actually get there. Probably the most widely read book in this list is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It gently introduces a variety of facets of interdependent, healthy relationship, guiding step by step from the cultural experience most of us have been raised or educated within, through to an introduction to Indigenous relationship with place and the responsibilities that come with being human. She plants the seeds of possibility for those of us who have been raised within an ownership story of land and plants, of language like natural resources, plant material, and property. After braiding Sweetgrass, but before trying to strike up a relationship with the local Indigenous community, I really recommend reading the book Becoming Kin, an Indigenous call to Unforgetting the Past and Reimagining Our Future, by Patty Krawec. In it, Patty walks the reader, who is presumed to be from a settler background, through a series of stories and steps for, as the title suggests, unforgetting our past and reimagining possible futures. There is a recommendation for a personal action to take at the end of each of the chapters. And this book is an excellent introduction to some of what we should all know before asking Indigenous people to be in community with us. Exploring more facets of Indigenous perspective, the book Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World by Tyson Yunkaporta turns the Indigenous gaze on settler culture, describing patterns that occur here and comparing and contrasting them with patterns that in his and other Indigenous cultures. His wonderfully sarcastic wit comes through particularly well in the audiobook version, which he reads himself. Well, I think that this book is for everyone, and I think that Braiding Sweetgrass is for everyone. I suspect that this book would resonate with those who identify with traditionally masculine or protector roles, the way that Braiding Sweetgrass resonated with so many who identify with the role of mother or caregiver. He also has the new book out, Right Story, Wrong Story, Adventures in Indigenous Thinking, that I'm looking forward to reading, but it doesn't seem to have a Canadian publisher yet, which is really frustrating because I know it exists and I can't get it. One of the many pieces that I took away from this book was the comparison between how settler and Indigenous cultures approach things. In settler culture, we tend to start with an action, and then we ask why our action didn't have the desired or expected outcome. Then we get to know the community we're trying to affect. Then once we get to know that community, we are impressed by the wonder, wisdom, and complexity of what we have come to know, and probably just harmed with our rush to action. And this is the reverse of Indigenous process, which begins from respect, seeks connection and then reflection on what is understood, what is desired, and who will be affected before taking action. Diving further into Indigenous perspectives, the unlikely piece at Kuchumakuk, The Parallel Lives of People as Plants, Keeping the Seeds Alive by Martin Prechtel, is an exploration of Martin's experiences growing up in a Pueblo community, his years apprentice to a shaman in a Tutihil Mayan community in Guatemala, still actively holding on to and practicing pre-colonial culture, and his eventual flight with his family back to the United States from the violence of Guatemala's Civil War. The contrast between the rich complexity of being complete, juicy humans in an eloquent and complex world and the emotionally flattened version of humanity that we are so commonly expected to perform in much of Western culture today was particularly striking to me. His lyrical storytelling follows the parallels of these contrasts into the ecological world, exploring how cultures shape our physical reality and how the flattening of culture and human expression is extended outward, flattening the ecological world around us. He also tells of keeping the seeds, both of complex Indigenous culture and of the plants that are part of culture, alive in this hostile to them environment, and offers guidance on ways to start planting new seeds that, with time and tending, can grow into juicy, complex, life-supporting relationship with place. Martin's book, The Smell of Rain on Dust, Grief and Praise, continues the exploration of the flattening of our emotional lives, especially around our cultural avoidance of grief. When we refuse to grieve, we deny both the pain of the grief and the ecstasy of the love, because they are twined together and do not exist without one another. Deep love demands an equal capacity, both at a personal and a community scale, for deep grief. In avoiding the one, the other becomes equally shallow. When losses are not held sacred and the space for grief is denied, it halts that flow of life. It becomes a toxic brew of rage and desire to push our pain out onto those we blame for our pain, or a numbing, disconnected apathy in a constant quest for the next distraction. In our denial and avoidance, we become addicted to the rage, or we fall in love with the stasis of death, turning away from the glorious, loud, emotional, and physical mess of life. Healing our relationships with each other, with who we are, with where we are, requires us to grow our capacity for our grief and our praise, to grow our capacity for love. Hierarchical culture relies heavily on moving the harms to where they are out of sight, to outsourcing decay, as Tyson Yunkaporta says in Sand Talk. Some of what we take for granted we have because it is extracted, or so much of what we take for granted is, sorry, I just keep having pop-ups. So much of what we take for granted we have because it is extracted from our lives or labor of people and communities out of our sight. Following the threads of connection from our lives to those costs can unearth a lot of pain that we might prefer not to know about, or grief and anger that we don't know what to do with. I think that the teachings in The Smell of Rain on Dust offer some tools and guidance for holding ourselves open to that process and allowing it to change us, what we value and the choices we make. If we can reverse the outsourcing of harm trend, if we can bring the costs as close to home as possible, we will be that much more inclined and able to make them as small as possible, bringing them back into proportion with what healing we can offer to balance out the harms. At the center of almost every Indigenous teaching I've come across is relationship, but coming from a culture that promotes, praises, and rewards independence, while also suffering from what has been described as an epidemic of loneliness, good examples of complex, thriving community can be really hard to find, much less create without any examples. If we want to get away from an interdependent relationship with the colonial capitalist economy, we need to reclaim interdependent relationship with human and more than human community. Community sounds great, but how do we actually do it? That is the question that opens how we show up, reclaiming family, friendship, and community by Mia Birdsong. When wound up in navigating and surviving capitalism, very few people have the capacity to take on even more responsibilities, and everyone we know is busy. Mia explores these issues through a series of interviews and stories about real people creating real-world community. Community happens when we intentionally commit to it to the extent that we reshape our lives around connection, or when our lives fall apart so completely that we have to let go of independence, ask for help, and truly, deeply rely on each other. Terrifying, I know. But this book includes plenty of practical suggestions for breaking out of our patterns of independence and restrictive nuclear family models and starting to take on and share out responsibilities of care and well-being. It also includes practical advice about stepping out of the boundaries that we set around ourselves to avoid emotional entanglement or vulnerability, and about setting intentional boundaries around who and what gets to take up our time. So many of us that speak about care are caregivers, but for that to work to really flow at a significant level, for reciprocity to be possible, we also need to receive care. The Future is Disabled: Prophecies, Love Notes, and Morning Songs by Leah Lakshmi P. Epsha. My practices. Piepsha Na Samar Singha dives even further into connection and interdependence. While not the actual reason that I'm recommending this book, the author also does a beautiful job at the start of articulating why I found a lot of the getting back to normal messaging in year 2 of the pandemic so absolutely infuriating. The economy isn't, in fact, the most important thing for us to save. While this book unapologetically centers disability, it isn't just people who already fall all below capitalism's line of valuable that our exploitative hierarchy is not inclined to save. We're all disposable in this model, so we all need to work on creating something else. This book does some of the dreaming and exploring of what something else is and could be, with a particular exploration of mutual aid. All of it, including the difficult bits, the challenges, the times when our histories of hurt and acquired survival skill choke up our words when we are asked to be vulnerable enough to express our needs, the times when we get tired and frustrated with the constant needs and demands of others, the times when support and codependence get blurred together, but also the times when we ask for what is really important to us and we receive it, when the support we offer really makes a difference, when the challenges and struggles are balanced with successes and joy. If we're going to try to step out of the hierarchical pyramid of the capitalist hellscape, having at least a general idea of what to expect from the start can prepare us for when the shine wears off, when the positive, uplifting idea encounters conflicting goals and value and trauma patterns, personality clashes, and fatigue. Having some examples of how others have navigated these realities can help us through them when it's our turn so that we can actually stick with the work. I also particularly love the stories of unashamedly taking up space while existing in a world that expects you to fit in, shut up, or disappear if you deviate from a fairly narrow set of supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist norms. There has been a lot of thinking, dreaming, practicing, change-making, writing, and teaching being done by those who are most blatantly disvalued and harmed by the hierarchical systems. If those of us who have so far managed to fit in well enough to get by would like to participate in creation of change, of rendering the hierarchy obsolete, we could do a lot worse than to learn from and support their efforts. So if we want to be part of a healthy world, we need relationship. And if we want relationship, We need to be caring, accountable, and vulnerable. So how do we do that? Exactly. Can somebody please explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old? Because I think that's about when I started learning independence and to stop being so emotional. And I really doubt that I'm alone in that. And my experience of years of working in the not actually green industry of horticulture and landscaping left me with a pretty strong tendency to ask, is this really green, i.e. is this healing, or is it just less destructive than what we're used to at this moment? Far too often, it's the second rather than the first, whether in community or in ecology. I don't want to pour any more time or energy into only doing less harm in my work and volunteering. I kept coming back to that question of how do we have a thriving relationship rather than how do we just cut back on the harm and exploitation pouring down onto the human and the more than human world. How to actually move away from the presumption that is our fate and role as humans to do more harm than healing. When we find ourselves on the harming side of a harmful relationship, the onus is on us to change, to learn the practical, social, and emotional skills of being in healthy relationship, and if possible, make amends. There are surprisingly few resources out there on how to stop harming, not just in the human ecosystem relationships, but even in human-to-human relationships, but they do exist. One that I came across while searching for books on the topic is The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. The relationship between men and patriarchy Bell Hooks describes in this book carries really strong parallels to the relationship between settlers, including those of us of settler descent, and colonial capitalism. It may look like it is serving us and be the only system we are currently equipped with the skills to exist within, but it causes us an incredible amount of harm and sentences us to disconnection and grief and leaves us responsible for incredible amounts of harm to others. White supremacism, capitalism, and patriarchy are all just different applications of the same pattern of hierarchy. They all embody disconnection, control, and exploitation and leave wounds on everyone involved. Several of her calls to change and calls to support those working on change, rather than only focusing on what we're doing wrong or have not yet learned to do, apply perfectly well for settlers working our way out of hierarchy and into community with ecosystem. But I needed more specific resources. And in the 20 years since her writing of this book, some have come along. A lot of people raised in children should be seen and not heard, and I'll give you something to cry about. Households are determined to not repeat these patterns when raising their own children. The first rejection of authoritarian relationship can move from authoritarian to the opposite end of the same spectrum, ending up at what gets called permissive parenting. This avoids the violence, but also often defaults to avoiding conflict and difficult emotions and fails to teach communication and boundary setting skills needed for healthy relationships at any age. The ecosystem equivalent is the conservation that protects ecosystems by entirely removing humans from the landscape on the presumption that truly healthy interaction isn't possible. Oops. I hit the scroll on my mouse. There we go. Or at least I hit scroll on the wrong window. In gentle parenting, sometimes called authoritative as opposed to authoritarian or permissive parenting, you can find examples of practical information on how to dismantle intergenerational patterns of hierarchical control and instead cultivate safety and connection and hold room for difference, mistakes, accountability, and mutual growth. A lot of these skills and practices apply equally well within more than human relationships. It also comes with bonus of lots of examples that really do explain things like I'm a 2-year-old, usually paired with explaining the exact same thing to me like I'm an adult responsible for raising a 2-year-old. My top recommendation on this topic is actually a person rather than a book. Chaz Lewis, who goes by the handle of Mr. Chaz on a whole bunch of social media platforms, shares a lot of really helpful ideas, information, and practical real-world examples of healthy relationship skills. I also just signed up for a reparenting membership with Generation Mindful. Reparenting takes the skill building and caring approach of gentle parenting and directs it towards ourselves as adults, along with a good dose of emotional healing work. I'm definitely one of those who's much better at giving than receiving care, and I'm hoping that taking the time to work through the resources in the course and participate in the mutual support gatherings it includes will help me peel back the protective layers and replace them with healthy boundary setting instead, which may look like this is really scary. If you would prefer a book recommendation on the topic of gentle parenting, I did find lots of interesting pieces in Hunt, Gather, Parent, What Ancient Cultures Can Teach Us About the Lost Art of Raising Happy, Helpful Little Humans by Michaeline Doucleff. And hey, she even quotes Braiding Sweetgrass in that book. So we come full circle on some of these things. I'm getting into all of this because a lot of us lack some really foundational skills of being in healthy relationship. Commitment, acceptance, recognizing and communicating our needs, respecting the needs of others, setting and honoring boundaries, conflict resolution, participating in generative conflict, trust, vulnerability. All of these require practice. And some of us have never even had real life examples of all or any of these to learn from. The reparenting side of gentle parenting focuses a lot on these sorts of things, often breaking them down into really straightforward examples of how to go about practicing them, something that Mr. Chaz does really well in his short videos. I also think an equivalent resource that focuses on learning and building our more than human relationship skills is something that we, uprooted from place, humans really could benefit from. And I'll come back to that a little bit. A couple of things that I've taken away from gentle parenting spaces that apply whether we are 2 or 42 or 82 are for participation to be constructive rather than frustrating or disappointing. It needs to start with possible yet meaningful tasks. It doesn't need to be easy, but it does need to be possible. It needs to contribute and it needs to have a next step as our capacity increases. The other big thing I've learned is to focus on the desired action. Telling a toddler to stop throwing blocks puts all the attention on throwing blocks and demands impulse control that a 2-year-old brain or a tired brain or a stressed brain, we don't have a lot of impulse control, if any. Say instead, we can play with the blocks like this, or we can play with the blocks like this, or if you like to throw things, we can get some soft toys, or we can take some balls outside and throw them. Put the attention on what to do rather than what not to do. If we want people to stop growing monocultures, we need to provide practical advice on how to care for and accept care from complex ecosystems. If we want people to stop driving cars, we need to provide practical possible alternatives. If we want people to stop participating in and reinforcing hierarchical capitalist systems, we need to provide practical steps for participating in an alternative. Focus on the desired action. Work out the first meaningful possible step and invite people to get involved in the change. I've watched this happen in the pollinator garden and native plant world in the last few years as gardeners, including absolute beginners, become passionate advocates for actions that are possible and while they may be small individually, really do matter. Sorry, keep doing that. Yes. A lot of what Mr. Chaz explains about what is going on in the brains of parents and children, especially when we slip into self-protection mode, is also explained in the book Unwinding Anxiety. You know, if you'd rather skip the explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old part, but you'll be missing out. He's really good. Unwinding Anxiety, new science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind by Judson Brewer is a very practical guide for using curiosity and observation to reconnect bits of ourselves that we have learned to hide away, either to keep them safe or because we were taught things like tears or anger or needs were bad and we could not show them if we were to be loved or even safe. This book is all about reconnecting with and reintegrating the bits and pieces that we've learned to avoid or distract ourselves from, and how to unwind the often self-harming patterns we use for distraction or self-comfort with observation, curiosity, and acceptance rather than anger, shame, or avoidance to get back to being complete, juicy humans. With all our unlearned patterns and newly learned skills, we also need new stories. In his sadly final book, The Power of Story on Truth, the Trickster, and New Fictions for a New Era, Harold Johnson teaches about how the stories we tell ourselves shape us. Not in the, I'll tell myself that I'll get a Ferrari, and if I believe it hard enough, I'll get one, with the corollary that if you don't get one, you fail to believe hard enough, but in the very real way that our self-facing narratives shape our personal actions, and that the stories we believe about the world we live in shape how we interact with the world. The stories of those around us also influence our lives through their actions. Canada is a story. Borders are a story. Money is a story. This book does an excellent job of presenting the power that stories have and our power to shape stories without falling into the trap of subtly blaming people who are caught up in the harms of stories shaped by others. So what is the story we want to be telling ourselves and others? Reinforcing, whether intentionally or accidentally, the pyramidal hierarchy, it undermines the work of everyone trying to transition away from it. Assisting in the cultivation of circles of care supports everyone working to transition toward them. For those of us from settler backgrounds and coming to this work from the plant world, expanding the conversation around caring for land to include caring for humans not only opens up the possibility of learning from others who have already tackled similar challenges, it creates a space for voices and perspectives that are often excluded from conversations and decision-making around the care of land, and can create a space for mutual support as we each bring our strengths and our experiences into the circle. We can co-create a new story. Back in the late summer, I brought the issue of differentiating between work that is about survival within the pyramid and work that is about learning and practicing how to survive without it to the Society for Organic Urban Land Care, where I volunteer as a board member. This led to a meeting of our membership in November, where the decision was made to begin exploring the creation of resources and practical guidance for anyone looking to move from a relationship of hierarchy to a relationship of care within the complete ecosystem. Building up those resources will require Soul as an organization to engage with others who have skills, experiences, and perspectives to share on the cultivation of responsible, caring relationships. It will also require us to consider how what each of us does contributes to pyramids of hierarchy and to circles of relationship, and an openness to reimagining what livelihoods and caring for land can be. The first step of that process is gathering together for conversations, sharing ideas, and co-creating the next step. We'll be working to practice a consensus approach both in designing a process and in the creation of whatever resources we eventually agree would be appropriate. We'll be starting from the question of what being in good relationship is in practice, rather than how land care can fit within currently widespread ideas of gardening and horticulture. We will have conversations exploring the histories and the patterns that have led us to where we are today, what creates a healthy relationship with place, ecosystem, and human community, how working with plants and other more than human life can help gently hold and support people through unpacking, grieving, and healing our capacity for relationship and responsibility. We would love to have your participation in the process. You don't need to be a member of SOL, but you're more than welcome to support SOL's work by joining as a public member. I'll be sending out a link to the recording of this presentation and a list of books that I've mentioned to everyone who registered for today's talk. I'll include in that email the invitation to join in on the conversation. Please feel free to share this invitation with anyone in your circle who is interested or engaged in related or complementary work. This wraps up my prepared presentation. Thank you all for your presence and your attention.